Much gratitude there for Mark Zimmerman covering our music today and Cliff Harden for his beautiful in-gathering music. My friends, we know there is a lot of friction in our country right now. It seems how synchronistic that our theme of the month is friction. And we know that our country cannot heal if we can't name that friction and the conflict, unless we dive into an understanding of its cause. Some causes go back into history like long threads, tying humanity together in unseen and unconscionable ways. One particularly long thread begins in a time before measurement, in a time of myths and stories, a time when creation begins to take form and serve function. The time of Abram, later to be known as Abraham. He's the patriarch of a small band of people who believed in one God. They were monotheists among a land of polytheists. And this particular story begins with Abraham hanging out outside. Maybe he's standing on a hill or in a field. Abraham is anxious, and like so many people, when they're anxious, they start to talk with God. Abram is bewildered. He's scared, and he's worried about his future and the future of his family. And for many people for which he alone was responsible. He's 75 years old, we know. He has a wife, Sarai, later to be known as Sarah. They don't have any children of their own at this time, but he is responsible for his nephew Lot. And in that conversation, God gives a commandment. Abram, I want you to pack your family up and all your worldly possessions. I want you to pack up your slaves and all your people, and I want you to go to Canaan. Now, Abram wasn't always obedient, but this time he was. So he packed everything up and went to Canaan. The problem was that Canaan was already occupied. No worries, said God, to your offspring I will give this land. Build your altar to me. And Abram pitched his tents. After some time, he grew restless again and stepped outside, and again, feeling scared, said to God, what's next? God said, raise your eyes now. Look from this place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all that land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if you can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. So rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. And then there was a long list of great nations known at that time. And in stages, Abram proceeded to claim that land. Genesis chapters 12 and 13 spell it out. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses, I will curse you. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And this is now the land of Abraham. He was singled out as a great, great patriarch. He was given prosperous nations, and all the nations of the earth were to bless themselves by him. This is the covenant with Israel. It's based on the view of expansionism and the conquering of others. It's a creation story of a people, a core identity. It is everything for Israel and is built upon this story, this narrative, this myth, this historical event. It doesn't matter if it believed it happened or not. It's not about logic or reason. It's about belief and the power of the story, how it informs identity and powerful images and metaphors that are feeding a worldview that in turn forms values and our decisions. It's a story of reassurance, I've got your back, said God. You're good to go. You're my people. I'm your God forevermore. Done deal. When Christianity emerged, it built upon this covenant. But a crucial step was taken by the church leaders. They separated Jesus from Judaism and Israel's covenant with God in the 4th century, when they established a new covenant under the Trinity. They appropriated and rebuilt this new covenant into a broader entry and access to God with new images, a new narrative, and a new agenda. The theory was that all people who accepted Jesus and the one true God would be saved. The problem was that when this came through Europeans and their embedded caste system and belief in an elevated white race. So really, this was a white God for white people. Successive papal bulls in the 15th century lived this out when it was the doctrine of discovery was established. This is truly a horrific series of doctrines that merged Christianity with caste system, racism, and God's promise of all people through invasion, searching out, capturing, vanquishing, and subduing a long list of anyone basically who was not Christian. And it applied to basically everywhere that wasn't already under the control of the crown. This doctrine of discovery was based upon manifest destiny by divine right in the name of God. The 15th century turned the theological foundation of Abraham and Israel's covenant into the underpinnings of an extraordinary and horrific nationalized and corporate engagement of the slave trade and the colonial enterprise. The articulation of the doctrine of discovery took root in well-prepared and powerful series of creation stories. This powerful and provocative narrative compelled colonizers through financial support of Portugal and Spain with their embedded caste systems to this continent. But like Canaan before, this continent was already occupied. No matter, they said, tents were established, altars were planted, in the name of freedom of religion of all things. And 400 years of systemic annihilation began. The history of this United States is built upon ideology and theology of white supremacy. It's built upon slavery and policies and laws of land theft and brutal genocide. This is a truth still dividing our nation today and present in this election, presented in the clear demarcation of evangelical Christians' overwhelming support of current outgoing president's racist and xenophobic policies and his explicit hateful language. They believe he was chosen by divine right, manifest destiny. All of us are subject, though, all of us are subject to the powerful, unconscious storyline of manifest destiny. It's particularly embedded in demands for adherence to patriotism and nationalism, or loyalty to the state and its deep values. We can simply call it exceptionalism. It's the American way, and it is embedded in our education, our military, our justice, our government, our churches. It's embedded in our hymns and our scriptures. It's embedded in our Constitution, which for many citizens has become a symbol for God. So many of us proclaim Thomas Jefferson, and we as Unitarians like to claim him as one of our own, as a Unitarian, and we minimize his holding of slaves. But Jefferson was the architect and the visionary for the annihilation and eradication of the indigenous people. Andrew Jackson, he was the implementer. Unitarian Universalists are not exempt. We have a long history of exceptionalism, with our history deeply intertwined with the founding fathers and the powerful elite of Boston. Many historians and Unitarian Universalists among them have fashioned stories of exceptionalism with a story of merit. Exceptionalism must be earned, so we have a great exceptional story. Those who escaped tyranny crossed the great ocean to subdue the wilderness. They worked hard. They earned their way into nationhood. They tamed the savages and turned their wild ways into civilized and peaceful coexistence. This is the story we've been telling ourselves. That's the story I learned as a child, and for too many, it's still being told. That story of manifest destiny was in President Obama's 2009 inauguration speech. This extraordinary narrative ignores those who already lived here with lives and stories. Creation myths of great nations and peoples whose worldviews are completely different than the Western European. Rather than expansionism and conquering, rather than usury, rather than subduing, rather than riches and fame, rather than power over and domination of women and the land, the indigenous people who already occupied this stunning country coexisted with this land as its nurturer and sustainer. They call this land Turtle Island as part of its own beautiful creation story. Pam Tinker's beautiful Selu Coin Mother creation story is one of many. It's based on ensuring for future generations, just like Abraham wanted, ensuring for future generations, but through an ethic of care for the land, through a matriarchal lineage. Sorry, Abraham, your character has been cut out of this story. I'm not going to romanticize Native peoples. I'm not going to place them on a pedestal of nature-based perfection. Nations have inner wars and conflict. All people need to learn and grow to find how to create peace and prosperity. But learning and growing matters in each culture, in each historical context, and that is the point. Every nation, every people deserves respect and sovereignty to determine their own destiny. The U.S. is struggling its destiny, struggling to understand our place in the world and our relationships among ourselves and with those nations already within our borders. So we are divided because we are, and we have been for a long time. There's a spectrum in our country right now, a spectrum of understanding, a slow awakening to the U.S. dominant colonizing story. A narrative that has been driving us for so many millennia. It is a story with horrific wrongs that are still happening today. Military language is historically and actively filled with harmful Native Indian terms such as Indian country, noting enemy territory. We call this expansionist doctrine of discovery. We still carry it with us, the call by God all across the world with 800 bases in 70 countries. And you may not know that the legal argument for holding and torturing prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, the legal argument for doing such horrendous acts was based upon the capture and the murder of indigenous people in the 19th century. The courts accepted these arguments. We did it to them, so we can still do it. President Trump's event at Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills of the Sioux, sacred lands, that is blatant doctrine of discovery and explicit demonstration of his divine right. The Mashpee Wampanoag Nation in Massachusetts, they are actively under siege by the Department of Interior for recognition as a sovereign people. They're in courts now against the Department of the Interior. In August, on a plus side, I suppose, the Supreme Court finally recognized that just half of Oklahoma is actually Native American land. Good news. 400 years late, but good news. And a small but important illustration, my friends and lovers of Hamilton, he was not an immigrant, he was a colonizer. No mention of Indigenous people is anywhere in those beautiful lyrics that we love to sing. The story of Hamilton in the musical is told from the story of the winner. As Unitarian Universalists, we have taken a strong public position to disconnect ourselves from our privileges and our strength. We have taken a position to support Indigenous people by publicly disassociating ourselves from the doctrine of discovery, voting on it repeatedly at our General Assembly, committing to learning about truthful stories told by Indigenous people. So to commit to that, to the next step, the UUA has a teach-in November 18th to the 26th, just coming up next week. And I'm going to put more information about that teach-in in the chat in a little while. It'll be in the Wednesday newsletter as well as on our Facebook. It's already been posted. I also want to recommend 2 books that I'm going to put in the chat after this as well. First is Unsettling Truths, The Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery by Mark Charles and Soong-Chan Rah. And the second is Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. That second one, in Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, was actually published by our own UUA publishing house, Beacon Press. My friends, my beloved, if we, and by we I mean predominantly white Euro descent, really want to live our principles as Unitarian Universalists, among them justice, equity, and compassion for all, then we need to shift our worldview. The narrative we have been living by is still decimating and destroying those who have been living among us long before us. An awakening takes time, a shifting of worldview, of raising awareness of our reactions and our decisions. It takes hard work, education, and a lot of humility. The naming of deeply held values and painful reconciliation. But it also takes creativity and a reimagining of old stories into new ones based on our capacity to change. And we can. When I was 22 years old, I was at a dinner party with a group of friends in Denver, and the topic of land issues in the Southwest came up. And it was particularly around mineral rights for Indigenous people. One of my friends said, those Navajos and Hopis, why do we still have to deal with those issues? It happened so long ago and it doesn't affect me. I was silent. I knew something was wrong in that statement, something deeply wrong, but I didn't have the knowledge to explain why it was wrong. I didn't have a way to debate or the courage to simply say, because they matter. I don't know why, but they matter. What is happening to them has been happening for a long time and is still happening. Instead, I kept my mouth shut because I lacked the intellectual knowledge, but I did not have the trust in my own intuitive awareness that I was raised with as a Unitarian Universalist, that there was an injustice happening. As we are dealing with friction, a theme of our month and in our country, we know we can't heal unless we name what is happening. We may not have all the facts and the figures and be able to debate, but we know that something is wrong, deeply and profoundly wrong. As we approach this Thanksgiving annual celebrations, I know it's hard this year because we're not in our families in such normal way of being with each other. But maybe this disruption is a time for deep reflection. Find ways to be grateful for our gifts and our privileges, both small and large. Yet we are compelled as liberal religious people to ask questions about our origin story. The ancient truth that victors write the history cuts deeply for those still living under the crushing blow of the victor. Asking questions, hearing painful stories, it has to lead to outrage and calls for justice. Some of the stories are ones of courage, though. They're ones of resistance by our indigenous peoples. For centuries, they have claimed their sovereign freedom and held on to their culture and their way of life. We have so much to learn from them and their powerful teachings and how they have succeeded. What are they telling us now? What do they want? They want their precious sacred lands back. It's that simple. Start with the Black Hills, please. Give it back to the Sioux. Start with returning their belongings, their sacred artifacts, their bodies, their bones that are long held in museums, including the Smithsonian. They are held all over the US despite federal law stating they must be returned. We need to reclaim an ancient story that has been assimilated and contorted by ego-driven leaders. The God of Abraham taught it is sin to be separated from one another and from the land. The new covenant that Jesus was teaching was the spiritual-based life, not materialistic. Jesus was teaching a new covenant based on radical love and life-changing compassion. It was based on love and care of God's creation. I don't care if you're an atheist, agnostic, or theist. It is about care of creation. As we enter into the season of Thanksgiving, may you find gratitude deep in one another. Gratitude in the Mother Earth, provider of all, sustainer of our future generations. May you open your hearts. Hear the grief in this land, for it has been wronged. There is blood in the soil and tears falling from the sky. May it change you. May you hear the stories and understand the need to join our voices with those who have been crying out with a wolf's lament. We can celebrate creation through our mutual stories, our love of the land, our ethic of care, by celebrating with those who have been on this land for millennia. It is time to return to more sacred covenant, my friends. Care for one another and care for the earth. Amen and blessed be.